And I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
When bigots and bullies ruled through violence and fear, their victims resisted with grace and with peace. This is the story of America's civil rights pioneers who changed the course of history, from Dr. King and the ministers to the students who led the first wave of sit-ins and the freedom rides to prison.
You didn't get scared off? You think, wait a minute, this is just too risky?
No. I mean, you're going to die for something.
We'll travel from Tampa to St. Augustine to Atlanta and Birmingham, from the walled-off hideout where Dr. King planned the campaign to the jail where he wrote his famous letter and smuggled it to his secretary, piece by tiny piece.
And he kept bringing these little pieces of paper in. And Wyatt said, "My dear, you've got to start typing." And I thought, from what?
We'll relive the fight for freedom in this special presentation of Fox 13 News, Sunshine and Dignity, Florida's Path to Equality. Hello, I'm Craig Patrick, and we will start in Birmingham, Alabama, which was the center of the civil rights struggle and at one point the most segregated city in the nation, because its Commissioner of Public Safety ran this city like a tyrant.
You can never whip these birds if you don't keep you and them separate.
By whipping birds, Bull Connor meant blasting kids with fire hoses, ripping their flesh with dogs. Connor also coordinated with the Ku Klux Klan as it terrorized, beat, and killed.
The people that hated us at that time would have been happy to kill all of us at one time. It was terrifying.
And police wouldn't stop any of it because men like Bull Connor ran the police.
You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
He embodied a malice that had festered in America for hundreds of years. First, white supremacists captured, enslaved, and maimed people from Africa, then lost a rebellion for their states' rights to keep their slaves, then formed a domestic terrorist network to intimidate and murder African Americans, and fused white supremacy into their faith.
The church taught that people of color were not fully human. They did not have souls capable of redemption. That was the message from the preachers.
And for entertainment, white performers dressed in blackface to ridicule African Americans.
Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow.
The blackface stage character called Jim Crow was an amalgam of demeaning stereotypes that Southern bigots had in mind when they passed and enforced Jim Crow laws. They enforced racial segregation to separate, degrade, and oppress African Americans.
I had a coworker who had a heart attack, and I worked at a hospital, and not a single doctor or nurse would touch him. So we put him on the loading dock until the public hospital ambulance could pick him up.
In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled against segregation in public schools, but much of the South ignored the ruling. That set the stage for ministers like Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, and Dr. Martin Luther King, who called for passive resistance. They said they would match the bigots' capacity to inflict suffering with their ability to endure it. And in 1955, the call for civil disobedience inspired a seamstress named Rosa Parks.
I had taken a seat on the bus. The driver demanded that I give this seat up for a white man. I didn't feel that I was being treated as a human being. I refused to give up this seat. I said no.
It drove boycotts with Dr. King in Montgomery, Alabama, and it inspired the sit-ins across the South, where blacks and whites sat together at segregated lunch counters.
You have no angry words.
But the mobs responded with violence, and in this upside-down world, police responded to the beatings by arresting the victims.
Well, they had grown up believing from the church, from society, from the law, that segregation was the way it should be. And I was going against it. I was a traitor. And our country has a history of what they do to traitors.
Joan Mulholland joined the first wave of sit-ins in North Carolina in 1960 and just kept going as they spread across the South.
And I say that is the power of Gandhian nonviolence.
This historic picture of activists in Jackson, Mississippi wound up on front pages and struck a nerve across the nation. That's Joan in the middle, as the mob poured mustard, ketchup, and sugar on their heads. As the Washington Post wrote, that counter now has 2 empty seats because the others have passed.
So right in that picture, we have the power of Gandhian nonviolence and the power of the press. So my hat is always off to the press. They were generally attacked just as fast, if not faster, than the demonstrators, because they were getting the story to the world.
In 1961, the world saw much more as civil rights pioneers called the Freedom Riders defied segregation in public busing. A mob surrounded the first bus in Anniston, Alabama, firebombed it, and planned to burn the Freedom Riders alive. The second bus reached Birmingham, where Bull Connor coordinated with the Klan, and a mob greeted the Freedom Riders with pipes. Other Freedom Riders picked up the ride from Birmingham to Montgomery, where they were beaten. Then on to Jackson, Mississippi, where segregationist Governor Ross Barnett told the mob to stand down because he had another idea. Mississippi arrested the Freedom Riders and sent them to the notorious Parchman Prison. Joan Mulholland was one of those Freedom Riders the guards welcomed to Mississippi.
What did they do to you in Parchman Prison?
Well, we had a sort of nasty vaginal exam when we first got there as ladies, and they put us on death row.
They sent the Freedom Riders to death row, cramming most into cells that had been empty, but they threw Hezekiah Watkins in with the convicted killers, perhaps because he was the youngest Freedom Rider. He was 13 years old.
What was the worst that you endured on death row?
I don't think I can say that on TV.
You were abused.
I was abused. If I had stayed there a few more days, I wouldn't be here right now.
Hundreds of other Freedom Riders arrived in Jackson and filled the prison cells until the Kennedy administration finally enforced integration in interstate transportation. The Freedom Riders did it.
The Freedom Riders, and indeed the civil rights struggle, certainly was a struggle for Black America, but it was also a struggle for the soul of America.
And from here, Dr. King would pick up the struggle with a decisive confrontation in Bull Connor's hometown.
Coming up, the movement takes off in Birmingham, Alabama, from 16th Street Baptist Church, a central meeting place for the activists and a target for the Klan.
I heard the horrific noise. Boom.
This is the climactic battle in America's civil rights movement, Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. Racist police boss Bull Connor and the Klan versus Dr. Martin Luther King and waves of kids like Jeff Drew.
Martin Luther King actually chose Bull Connor because Bull Connor was the perfect antithesis to what he was trying to do. We were nonviolent. Bull Connor was violent.
Jeff grew up on Dynamite Hill, an African-American neighborhood named for the hundreds of terrorist bombings by the Klan, documented in these newspaper photos.
And we could feel the effects of the blast through the rock, and it would actually lift us off the floor.
His parents built this tall brick wall around their home to protect them.
What was that wall built for?
Bullets. Every other day we'd find new bullet holes in the house.
And this home kept a secret house guest. This is where Dr. Martin Luther King planned and developed the Birmingham campaign.
Mom and Dad were very happy to provide a private, secret residence for him where he could have meetings and negotiations.
Dr. King and his fellow ministers organized sit-ins and boycotts at segregated stores. Police responded by arresting the ministers on Good Friday. King knelt and prayed on his way to jail. White clergy wrote an editorial urging him to quit, calling his peaceful protest unwise and untimely.
And that's what caused him to be in the frame of mind that he was in, that I have to answer. I have to give these men an answer.
That drove the next turning point when King wrote his response to the ministers from jail.
Letter from a Birmingham jail was a pivotal document of the civil rights movement. And what Dr. King said to his fellow clergy who criticized him.
King had no notepad in jail, so he wrote his letter piece by piece and smuggled the giblets to his secretary, Willie Pearl Mackey.
What did he write it on, and how small were some of the scraps?
He wrote on toilet tissue, not Charmin, it was the jailhouse toilet tissue. He wrote on the edge of the newspaper.
Her job was to fit the pieces together and get it out to the press within 3 days.
Some of it maybe That big. Just that big.
How did you know which part went where?
That was the trouble. That was the problem.
It was the most nerve-wracking and most important job of her life.
You'd move it around just like a puzzle and see if this part fit here, if that part fit there. Oh, okay, that's what he's saying.
And what he said, now is the time. And if there is an unjust law, I will non-violently oppose it, because I am seeking out not only freedom for African Americans, but I am seeking that America reach the pinnacle of what its values are.
And when a supporter bailed out Dr. King, he put his letter into action. He mobilized thousands of students for peaceful protests. The students gathered and poured out of 16th Street Baptist Church.
You are in violation of Section 1159 Dallas City Code.
Connor arrested them and loaded them into a fleet of school buses. The kids waved on the way to jail, knowing it would be their path to freedom.
This Birmingham movement is one of the most inspiring developments in the whole nonviolent struggle.
Then Connor tried to break up the protest by burning the kids, knocking them down with fire hoses, and ordering the dogs to attack.
Hold on back now!
Right in front of the press. This iconic picture made the rounds on newspapers and spread around the world. President Kennedy, who had focused on the Cold War more than civil rights, had to step up.
I was 7 years old, or 8, and laying on the floor watching TV, and the telephone rings in the kitchen, and it's the White House calling, and they ask, is Dr. King there? And I said, yes.
Behind the scenes at the Drew residence, Dr. King was shaming Kennedy into action.
And his response was, hello, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. President, hello, Mr. Attorney General, I'm glad you called. No, sir, I'm sorry, we're not going to call off the demonstrations. No, we're not going to call off the mass meetings. No, we're not going to call off the boycotts. And I want the public to know that you support Bull Connor and you support George Wallace and segregation and inequality. And we're going to continue the demonstrations until you do something about it.
He listened very sympathetically, and we had a most fruitful and rewarding discussion together.
And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
Keep your eyes on the prize. Hold on, hold on.
The walls of segregation were coming down. In August, America packed the National Mall with the March on Washington. Dr. King, facing growing death threats, gave the speech of his life.
The I Have a Dream speech is a goodbye speech. He's saying goodbye. He knew that his life meant less and less as the movement progressed.
The next month, the Klan struck 16th Street Baptist Church. 10 sticks of dynamite killed 4 girls in Sunday school.
I heard the horrific noise, boom, and it sounded like the building was swaying.
Barbara Cross was the pastor's daughter. Her best friend, Addie Mae Collins, died.
I gave her my wallet. I said, see you in a little while. And so students asked me, Ms. Cross, what did you have any parting words for her when you saw her? I said, I guess I was telling her goodbye and I didn't know it.
Barbara still mourns the attack that shocked the nation's conscience and helped compel Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
I urge every American to join in this effort to bring justice and hope to all our people.
And Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail became required reading in school.
I've often returned to Dr. King's letter.
And politicians from both parties often quote from it.
Dr. King's profoundly just and moral letter from a Birmingham jail continued
as a guiding light for running our country.
That injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action.
Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Yours for the cause of peace and brotherhood, Martin Luther King, Jr.
Coming up, the Birmingham campaign sparks the movement in Florida. A persistent mother takes down Jim Crow in our state, while Dr. King takes the struggle to St. Augustine and Florida's segregationist governor. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in Montgomery, Alabama, it motivated similar protests in Florida. Reverend C.K. Steele and FAMU students boycotted the Tallahassee bus system. Patricia Stevens-Dew helped lead Florida sit-ins. And Irvina Primus, a nurse from Jacksonville, integrated Florida schools in a story seldom told. But her daughter Irene is telling it now.
If they said you can't do it, she said, oh, we'll see about that.
Irvina's daughters, Jan, age 9, and Irene, age 7, were Florida's trailblazers when their mom enrolled them at Orchard Villa School in South Florida.
Arms just swinging away.
Arms swinging, back swinging, just enjoying it.
Irvina was Native American, and when she enrolled her 2 girls, she didn't tell the school their father is black.
So they didn't understand that they were enrolling African American students.
Exactly. They didn't know.
Until word spread on the first day of school and reporters showed up.
Look at your mom beaming with pride.
Yes, she was happy too. First step for integration. I guess she was excited too. But my father didn't like it. Not at all. My father was a mortician, and he was afraid.
He had seen death all too often.
Exactly.
And didn't want it to
be us on that table one day.
Local officials responded by filing a court challenge to kick the girls out, and with that, the principal sent them home on their first day of school.
She said, you might stop me today, but I'll be back tomorrow.
A couple of weeks later, she won in court, and the girls were back.
We had no problems with the other students. They were nice.
But sadly, before she knew it, the other students were gone.
I think not long after that, the school was totally African American. Not long after that.
Because all the white
families moved out of the neighborhood.
Well, that's not integration. That's
right. It went back. But this was the first step. And I think it straightened out after a few years.
And that's how it played out, from Orchard Villa near Miami to North Florida towns like Hastings.
It was a white flight issue. The white people left Hastings.
Because they didn't want to
They didn't want to go to school with black kids.
And as those families sent their kids to St. Augustine, Dr. King moved his campaign from Birmingham to St. Augustine. Segregationist Governor Ferris Bryant ordered an emergency police force to crack down, arresting King and others.
We must maintain law and order.
The civil rights activists who waded into the segregated beach were peaceful. The segregationists, though, were not.
As a group of whites attacked about 75 integrationists during a wade-in demonstration.
Florida drew national shame.
In the evening, rioting broke out in downtown St. Augustine as about 500 angry whites crashed through police lines and attacked Negro demonstrators.
Then this St. Augustine motel manager poured muriatic acid into a pool with African Americans. The video broadcast around the world, shocking the nation's conscience yet again. The U.S. Senate passed the Civil Rights Act the very next day.
The development of this development is merely the first step in a long journey toward freedom and justice in St. Augustine.
Meanwhile, on the other side of Florida, Irvina Primus was a long way from finished.
So what my mother did, she sued Dade County Parks and Recreation, and she won. So we started going to the pool.
Not just the pool.
And she did the same thing with the movie theater, with the beaches. She also fought for that, and she won.
She filed the lawsuits that crushed segregation ordinances through much of Florida. But she disliked attention and avoided exposure, so most people don't know.
Did she ever do an interview?
Never. Never. And I've been asked before, but I wouldn't, because I knew she wouldn't.
She died 10 years ago as racial tensions began to flare in our country yet again.
That's the only reason why I did this interview with you. It's because I'm so proud of her, and I think people should know.
If you don't appreciate how far you've come, you're liable to slide back to some degree to where you've been.
Sometimes I feel that way today. We're just sliding back just a little, but I think we're going to straighten that out. soon.
Coming up, the state of Dr. King's dream and where we go from here.
Well, Hezekiah Watkins was America's youngest freedom rider, but today even his own grandson doesn't understand what that means.
I was arrested 109 times as a freedom rider, and he would tell me, "Pop, you joking?"
In the coming weeks, we'll take a closer look at some of the lessons that may have been forgotten, how the civil rights movement took off across Tampa Bay, and how the ministers and students won the fight through nonviolent resistance. You can also take a deeper dive into some of the stories and pictures we've shared in this program by going to the Joan Trumpauer Mulholland Foundation, the Florida State Archives, and the archives of Birmingham, Alabama, and Mississippi. Thank you for watching. We'll continue to track Florida's path to equality.